Good afternoon. I would like to introduce our guest, Josie Olsvig. She is a new Southern author who lives in the Sea Islands of Beaufort, South Carolina. And in the past year, she has published two books, both of which are on Gullah culture of West African slave descendants living in the coastal Carolinas. Her children's book, entitled Growing Up Gullah in the Low Country, has been well received and is available through the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C., and other local vendors. Her historical novel, Gullah-Tears: The Enslaved Souls of Charleston, was released in November of 2020 and is set in antebellum Charleston, South Carolina. It is currently being adapted for a miniseries. In her private life, she was an attorney and social worker who spent her career addressing child abuse, domestic violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking. Her call to service was spurred by early life experiences growing up in poverty in the inner city. Josie experienced a great deal of hardship, strife, and violence and subsequently felt called to serve others. She was challenged to change her life circumstances and put herself through undergraduate and graduate school, where she gained degrees in social work and law. She also studied public administration and public policy at the London School of Economics. She was subsequently barred in multiple jurisdictions and admitted to the U.S. Supreme Court. Before her retirement, Josie wrote legal articles on social and child welfare issues. After moving to the South from the Midwest, she became deeply interested in the Gullah culture and race-based slavery. After a career fighting injustice, Josie chose pen to paper and focused on one of the greatest injustices of all time: slavery in the antebellum South. After publishing her first two books, she began writing articles for local and regional websites, blogs, and the Monarch African Diaspora Experience Museum in Dayton, Ohio. Welcome, Josie. So glad to have you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I wanted to start today by asking you a couple of questions regarding your novel, Gullah-Tears.
Okay.
I wanted to know how you were able to come up with the idea for the book.
There is a long story behind that, but briefly, it was a series of very vivid dreams, and I felt called um, to investigate the story of slavery. And this happened to me while I was still in Ohio, and out of the blue, my husband was transferred to Charleston, and we ended up living right by a plantation, and that kind of started my journey. So I've been on it almost 11 years now.
Wow.
Yeah.
And I understand your background and educational experience might be relevant to why you wrote the book, correct?
Well, there are aspects of, at first I thought I was not the person to do this. But I have found that a lot of my background, including growing up with a lot of hardship and poverty and being a victim of crime many times over. I am a child of the 50s. I grew up in the 60s and 70s. I was beat up in a race riot. I was held hostage in a holdup. I have been a victim of sexual assault more than once. Um, just a lot of violent crimes, domestic violence, things like that. And it helps me relate to oppression, I guess, and what it's like to be in that kind of environment. And then because of my experience, also I had friends who committed suicide and were murdered and whatnot. I grew up in the inner city in a predominantly Black area during the 60s and early 70s, and that's why I went into social work. Um, so through my social work, I understood more about hardship. Interestingly enough, I have worked inner city, big cities like Washington, D.C. I've lived in New York, I've lived in London, but I've also worked in Appalachia. And so I've seen poverty on both ends and hardship on both ends. My first clients, when I was first out of undergrad, half of them didn't have indoor plumbing. So, I've seen quite a bit, and that also helps me to relate to um, oppression and hardship. I have experienced, and when I interview clients, I also understand what they're talking about. And then, oddly enough, I thought I would be a tax attorney or something like
Mhm.
that in law school, but I was ended up working at the prosecutor's office, and I was asked because of my social work background, would I take the child welfare docket just for 6 months? So 30 years later, that's what I retired from. I ended up being an administrator at the end of my career, but um, as a prosecutor, um, I I really felt like I could not lose one of those cases. I really poured myself into my work. I always personally interviewed the victims. I always carefully read all the documents, and I was fortunate in that I never lost a case because I felt like I could not tell like a 7 or 8 year old child who'd been molested, sorry, I was busy this weekend. Um, so I can relate to that. I would go out on search warrants with the officers. And again, I always personally interview victims. And that helps me to relate to under, you know, the stories I had to hear about
Right.
what it was like to be tortured and things like that. And when I tell, like for instance, the first chapter of the book, um, which is being transported from Africa through the Middle Passage on the slaver ships and the sexual assault
Yes.
and the horrific conditions. I can picture all of that in my mind and understand what it's like from the victim's perspective. And so I think it helped me write what, literally what that was like for them coming over in those conditions.
Yeah, because when I was reading it, I was very descriptive and I could envision exactly what was going on to those people at the time in their life. And that
Yeah.
leads me to ask you about the extraordinary research that you did for the book, which I know was extensive. And how did you go about doing that?
I kind of went down every avenue I could think of. Because honestly, I didn't know much about I didn't know anything about Gullah culture. And what I had been taught about slavery, our textbooks were intentionally full of half truths. And so I have done everything from interviewing Gullahs. I always made the point, just like with victims, always interview them one on one so they are not saying things because of the people around them or the circumstances. I have done site visits, I've done archival research. I've gone from places everywhere from Hilton Head up to Washington, D.C., to the Library of Congress, to National Archives, to the National African American Museum, National Civil Rights Museum, um, and a lot of different places. But I think a lot of it, honestly, is having lived here in Charleston and now living in Beaufort, South Carolina, and the Sea Islands, where the culture has really been preserved even more here because in the Sea Islands they didn't have bridges like Hilton Head wasn't until the 60s
Oh,
that they
wow.
had bridges. So it was an isolated culture and much of it was preserved, particularly the language. And it's just talking to people.
Right.
When I have an opportunity, I just, pick up little tidbits about their rearing, their history, the history they've heard from their ancestors, and even like quilt making, for instance. Um, that did have, a big part in runaway slaves. Um, but I just pick up in any way I can um, through reading. I've read a lot of secondary sources. I think in my personal library, I can show you my office here, but I think I have like over 600 books, and that's
My
what
gosh.
I have purchased. Yeah. And
Impressive.
yeah, there's some books I have to go to, like the museum in Charleston or the Charleston Library, the South Carolina Library, and other, like the National Archives and whatnot, where I couldn't take them out. But so a lot of secondary sources, and then the primary sources like plantation records. Um, slaves were considered chattel property, but slave owners kept very detailed records about what they owned. So just like they would have their flour, sugar, how many cows they had, they kept detailed records about their slaves, and they would evaluate them every year. And it was actually seen eventually around by 1800 as an investment, as the safest investment you could make because the value would generally go up. So they were evaluated. There was a system of quarter hand, half hand, full hand as a field hand, but then if they had a skill as a butler, seamstress, whatnot, they would be evaluated for that.
That's
So,
interesting. I never heard of that before.
oh yeah. And I won't go off on a tangent, but because of the very careful records kept because they were a commodity on the slaver ships from importation from Africa to deportation in Charleston, there are careful records kept. And then at the point of sale, there are records, and then on the plantation. So you can trace your history back. Um,
And I know there was a lot of different storylines, just going through the book myself. And the character or storyline, what was the one that you related to the most? Was it Doll and Rosa, Lydia, or Henty, or Octavia?
um, I could really see life through all of them, but probably Henty, because and why I put her in the main house is so she could see it all. And her relationship with Big John, asking all the time, why is it done this way? Why do you do this? And what is Spanish moss? Why do we have it? Why is it here? All the different things she never experienced before.
Sure.
That she's taking in all that knowledge of why things are done that way. So probably Henty the most, because she has the perspective of everything going on the plantation, or she is told through Big John, who is the right hand man to the master.
Yeah, and that leads me to the next question, which is about learning about the Gullah culture, which she learned through him, obviously through Big John.
Yeah,
And had you been previously aware of this group of people before you wrote the book, which I think I remember you saying
no,
you
not
were.
at all. It again came to me through the dreams initially, and then I learned more once I was in South Carolina, and things I had no idea, especially how bad slavery was, and that Charleston was the main port of slave trade, and how oppressive it was. Charleston was kind of the worst of the worst with the caste system and how oppressive it was. I had no idea. And again, our textbooks were intentionally soft pedaling what slavery was. When I heard about as a child, when I read about a slave being whipped, I envisioned a belt, and not that that's not bad, but I had no idea that it was a cat of nine tails that was intentionally slicing open flesh and could remove all the flesh off of somebody's back and they could bleed out and die from that. I had no idea. And all the other the rape, and how common that is. That most planters had a white family and they had a brown family, illegitimate family through their slaves. And particularly in Charleston, there's literally fraternities from a brown family. It's called the Brown fraternity, the Brown. And they would even have fraternities for how dark they were.
Mm.
And these fraternities were really societies to help them if they did find freedom, that if the man would die, it would help support the widow and put the kid through school. There was a reason for it, but I had no idea that these things existed.
Why do you think the punishments were so severe to the slaves? I mean, all they were doing was their work to the best of their ability. And, there was one incident you mentioned in the book about, I think it was Henty spilling milk over the master.
It, well, two things. Um, it was like terrorism in a way, absolute control. If you think of I think of under Hitler's control, you had to be, well, here specifically, the numbers were so disproportionate. Um, like in the Sea Islands here, it was as much as 10 Black people to one white person. They had to keep absolute control. And if there was an uprising of some kind, if they got hold of weapons, the white people would be killed. And there had been, I want to say in the late 1700s in Haiti, an uprising, and that scared the white folks to death. But it was to keep absolute control and kind of just scare them to do anything. So, I mean, some of the punishments were absolutely horrendous for just small violations. And it would be very public, like hacking off the nose, hacking off genitals, a hand, a foot. And the first uprising in the Charleston area that was in the 1700s, what they did is ultimately, as the punishment after hanging them, they hacked off the heads and had them on pikes, had the heads on pikes on
Mm.
the road going out of town and left it there for like a month, just as a reminder. And to me, that's just absolute terrorism, but that's how they controlled.
You know, you mentioned a very famous resort in your book, the
Oh,
Greenbrier Hotel. I've been there myself. It's amazing.
yeah,
I was recently there about last March, and it is stunning in the way you describe it with the lush grounds. I mean, I vision it every day in my head. Reminds me almost of the White House, honestly, and
yeah.
the rose gardens and everything like that. But not to go on a tangent, but why was this setting so important to describe in the book? And do they, you know, it's interesting because they do offer some of the same outings that they used to have back then as well.
Yes. I too was struck by it for different reasons, and I would highly recommend this book to, get a good understanding of the history of the Greenbrier. And some of the more recent history is the bunker. That's what first grabbed me. And once that caught my attention, and kind of the 60s when, people like Bing Crosby and whatnot would go there for golf outings, that's what initially gained my attention. And then I went backwards to understand that that was the place to be if you were from the South. And people would go for what was called the social season. And it would start in May until about September. And why it was particularly important for Charleston is people needed to leave the area because we're in the close to the water base in the lowlands. We have yellow fever, we have mosquitoes, a lot of mosquitoes, yellow fever, and diseases like that come in the summer. So if you had money, you had to get out of the area. And so a lot of people from the South would go to the Greenbrier, and that was where marriage matches could be made, but it was also just where high society met. Some people were from the North, but particularly for the South, it was cooler regions, it was healthy, it was safe, and then the sulfur waters.
Right.
People believe that was the health potion, to either soak in it, and they would drink like 15 cups a day of this sulfur
Oh my
water.
gosh.
And they thought that was cleansing their bodies, and they believed in it. So, and people still do.
It's really a beautiful place. I mean, I would recommend everybody go visit it if they can, at least once in their life. The
Yeah.
views are stunning in itself, and the history and the bunker is really amazing. The story that they tell you on the tour, and I digress. Sorry.
Yes, I know. That's what originally got my attention too. It's gotten smaller and smaller, but and just that it was saved. They were about to close it.
Oh my.
Yeah, because it was losing money. It was not and then a local man, Jim Johnson, saved it. And he has his own story. He's a local lumberman success story. He still lives in his 1950s ranch style house, even though he's a millionaire and coaches the local girls basketball team. He
Wow.
saved it. He bought it.
Well, it's not exactly easy to get to. I mean, if you're in Washington,
No,
D.C., yes, but in the surrounding area, it takes a long time to get there.
yeah, it does, but it's
But
worth it.
yeah, absolutely worth it. And then I had a couple more questions, if that's okay. I
Yes.
wanted to know how John C. Calhoun helped bolster their way of life for the Gullah people, the way that they thought.
Um, John C. Calhoun and Rhett are the two people who really got this idea about slavery. What can I say? They really got the hatred and anger about keeping slavery going. John C. Calhoun said that actually slavery was a positive good because they were giving these poor, helpless creatures who couldn't take care of themselves, despite the fact that slaves came over with their own skills. I mean, the reason that we started bringing colored people here is that they have been successfully growing rice for over 2,000 years, something that the white man couldn't do. But he said these poor, helpless creatures were giving them clothing, housing, and teaching them a skill. And that was his contention. These poor, hapless creatures that, you know, we're also giving them a chance at going to heaven because they will have Christian masters. Yeah, even though he would beat his slaves and rape them too. But Rhett, another man who followed him, was really even worse than he was because he had a newspaper and just wrote all kinds of propaganda, and really got things going at the beginning of the Civil War. He really kicked things off and got emotions going. And it was in his paper that when the Civil War broke out, um, he edged it on to go ahead and attack Fort Sumter. But those two were really kind of the worst of the worst down here.
Yeah. It seems that way in the way you described it in the book as well about their attitude and how they acted towards them as just a cultural thing in general
Yeah,
too.
yeah.
And then I know you were telling me the other day when we talked on the phone that we can expect to see some more novels coming out in the future. Can you share a little
Yes.
bit about that?
Yeah. So what I'm envisioning with these books, it'll be an intergenerational story. So the children, um, in the very final scene, I guess I don't know for people who haven't read the book yet, but in
Hmm.
the final scene, one character is pregnant. Okay. And what will happen is her son and some other children will be involved in the Civil War, which is the next book coming out in September. There's so much to say about the Civil War, even just in this immediate area in Charleston and in Port Royal, where I am here in Beaufort. I thought I could do it in one book, and I came up with 57 chapters. So it's going to be a 2 volume work. But basically, what happened is Reconstruction started here in Beaufort. So the first book that goes up to the Combahee River Raid with Harriet Tubman, that book comes out in September.
Okay.
I have probably a third of the next book done, and my publisher says he wants to space it out by about a year. Um, so that book will be the finish of the Civil War and the beginning of Reconstruction. And then it would be the grandchildren are the Tuskegee Airmen
Hmm.
and in the Negro baseball leagues. And then I hope to enjoy retirement.
Oh, well, we're so blessed to have you. Honestly, it's a very special book if you haven't had a chance to read it yet. It's called Gullah Tears by Josie Olsbig and definitely worth reading. You can get it on Amazon.com and many other local vendors if you live in the Charleston area. Is there anything else that you would like to share with us today, Josie?
Um, the one thing I would say is different about this historical fiction book is I insert factoids, if you will, and I do more in the next book. Is there are sections biographical information about key figures and pictures of places actually that exist, pictures, historical pictures, and pictures currently what these places look like. And that's what I think sets it apart. That it's not just a story; it's based in fact, and it's thoroughly researched. So anything you read in there, it's the truth.
Thank you, Josie. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Have a wonderful day.
All right, thanks so much.